Let's take up this business of signs once more. You have not understood. You have remained rationalists, semioticians, Westerners. Let's emphasize it again. It is the road towards libidinal currency that must be opened up by force.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is openness to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we get going with today's guest, just want to throw out, I've got a Patreon at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider throwing me $1 a month to help with the costs of putting on the podcast. Very excited. We have the Libidinal Band is back together for Chapter 2 of Jean-Francois Lyotard's Libidinal Economy. And I've got returning players this week. Good friend Taylor Adkins, got cute Noumena, and young Agamben all back for the happy hour today. Are we ready to get libidinal?
Yes, sir. It's libidinal time.
Is it like Olivia Newton-John? Let's get libidinal. Libidinal.
It's a libidinal happy hour.
There you go. Do you want to do a little quick intro just in case anyone is unfamiliar with or just kind of stepping into the podcast today? Give a little bit of background on yourself before we get into the meat of the conversation. Whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I'm Taylor Adkins. You can see me and Coop doing lots of episodes on all kinds of stuff. Lyotard is just one of our most recent, but we also have done Larwell and Guattari, basically two of the books I translated by each thinker. And so that's mainly what I do. I'm a translator nerd and lover of all things philosophy, especially the Francais.
Go next. It's just cute Noumena here, and you could just say I'm a theory enthusiast and Twitter persona. So
Resident Kantian.
Resident Kantian.
Boo. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I'm young Agamben. Basically, just an orbiter of these other folks. Enjoy their content. Make some of my own content, but I got nothing to sell anybody yet. But I'll come up with a grift soon.
Nice.
Some way to make money off of it.
There you go. So, like I said, we're looking at Chapter 2 from the Hamilton translation of Libidinal Economy, and it's titled The Tensor. But to back up, I think we didn't go over in Chapter 1 one of the more important topics, and I wanted to discuss briefly at least, or kind of straighten out. I think we did comment on the Great Zero, but not at length. And I think we wanted to clear up a misconception. I think, Taylor, you said you had maybe misstated something about the Great Zero.
Well, it's my fault for bringing up Deleuze and Guattari and the fucking body without organs and shit. And even though we got something productive out of it, I remember, I think, Jung was we were talking about how zero isn't negative. The way that I was talking about it, at least, seemed to be a kind of a monster of Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari. The Leo Guattari thing, I don't know, a Leo Guattari. So yeah, I mean, we should go over the definition that he gives it, because it was clear as we were continuing to talk and I was rethinking what I said. I think Lyotard does want the Great Zero to have something to do with negativity or negation, and to use it in this way, contra what I was saying. It was like a productive mistake, I think,
yeah,
right? A happy
misreading.
Yeah, a happy accident. But yeah, we can go ahead and look at this definition.
I'm just going to straight up read the definition as Hamilton lays out. The Great Zero, the name Lyotard gives to the instance informing a particular but insistent dispositif on the libidinal band. With the disintensification of the bar, the libidinal band is folded back into a theatrical volume which has an inside and an outside, an appearance and essence, signs and signified. The inside is then ultimately considered in terms of what is going on the outside. One of the most important figurations of the outside is the Great Zero, which serves as a general term to cover the Platonic world of forms, God, the authentic mode of production, the phallus, etc. All these instances, and despite their differences, are effects of the slowing down of the bar referring the intensities running through the band to an elsewhere which they appear to lack once they have been confined to the interiority of a volume. The great zero is thus an empty center, which reduces the present complexity of what happens instantaneously on the band to a chamber of presence and absence. In his description of the great zero, Lyotard wishes to show us that all theories of signification are fundamentally nihilistic. So he is largely drawing from perhaps Lacan, at least if he's not outright calling it lack, it's at least sort of derived from Lacan's lack, maybe?
This in and of itself is, to me, like one of the most loaded sort of theoretical terms that Lyotard uses. Right. I think you could definitely relate it to Lacan, but I think something that always strikes me about the Great Zero is we can read the definition and we can sort of give our interpretation of it, but the Great Zero itself is sort of open to an almost infinite amount of interpretations. So I'm always hesitant to be like, this is what the Great Zero really is. Because I think for Lyotard, it's a very carefully used term. And it's like in this definition you just read, it is like a constant dispositif in his philosophy.
So he's saying it's one of the most important figurations of the outside is the Great Zero, which serves as this general term to cover the Platonic world of forms, God, the authentic mode of production, the phallus, etc. And all these instances, and despite their differences, are effects of the slowing down of the bar, referring the intensities running through the band to an elsewhere which they appear to lack once they have been confined to the interiority of a volume. So the volume, I'm guessing that's reference to the subject, perhaps?
Well, it's also what we talked about last time with topology, right? If the Mobius strip is this one-sided figure, then and if we consider it as, the band, which is intensified with these intensities running through it, with the slowing down, this cooling of the bar and the zero, that's when the Mobius strip is almost, in its, to put scare quotes, it's falsified, right? It's shown to be the opposite image of itself, right? It's static image rather than its dynamic figure. And so, if the strip is slowed down enough, or if the intensity is slowed down, it's only then that we can say there's an inside and outside to the Mobius strip. That's why he calls it a product of disintensification, right? It's only when it's intensified that we can no longer. I guess that's the thing. Is like the zero is not some sort of antecedent. The zero doesn't precede the intense strip, right? That the bar itself produces the zero as an effect of its intensification and disintensification. So I think that's something interesting. The zero isn't like the generator, like the one and the many or the other dialectics. Right. There's not like some one and zero that are doing a dialectic that then gets us to the band. And I think that's why it's different from the body without organs and all that other stuff that I brought in to kind of adulterate what we were talking about with Lyotard. Because this question of establishing a scenery is really interesting, right? In that second page, which we were talking about in our pregame, when he talks about dematerialization, which is obviously involved here as well, he talks about a mise en scene, but it's not what we normally know. It's not scene as spelled SCENE, right? It's not
the film term, yeah.
Right, the film term or the theatrical term of setting up a stage. It's the mise en scene of the setting in signs, right? It's how signs set a scenery. So the word scene there, they would be roughly homonymous in French. And I think that's an interesting play. I don't know if you guys caught that. So how signification with its inside and outside, with, Saussure's great bar, the signifier, the signified, which we'll get into today and all that stuff, how that also is a scenery, right? Is this creating of a staging.
Just this description of it as a general term that describes a Platonic world of forms, God, authentic mode of production, phallus, etc. It's interesting that there's a move towards materialism, but this sounds very much like a transcendent sort of thing, or like a metaphysical, rather.
Right. Because
like the Great Zero is a metaphysical thing, and maybe that's where perhaps Kant can help tease this out better.
I was just going
to
add to what you guys have already said, pretty much. And that's insofar as, the systems that you create. In this sense, it's like it says there on the definition, one of the most important figurations of the outside is the great zero, which serves as a general term to cover the Platonic world of forms, God in the authentic mode of production, the phallus. And if you see these as structures or systems, or even like in the Lacanian sense, the diagram that everyone memes, in that sense, there's that signification. It always lacks in terms of what it totalizes, if that makes sense. Or what it encapsulates. And you could maybe, to use a Kantian term loosely, it's like that's always like the noumenal, right? That which you always infer, but you know that it's there essentially for objects of experience, but you don't really know what makes up that world of the things in itself in themselves. But in this sense, the zero would be, once the band is slowing down, to use Lyotard's language, these intensities, if they're part of the same band, on one side you have the system or the structure, which is lacking in totalizing scope, then the only way that you can actually fill that up or fill that lack is through like a libidinal or an effective interpretation. And that's how that volume that he speaks about would be would come into the equation. So that there's this volume that you fill up, this theatrical volume, I would say, that is filled up with science, interpretation, systems, the philosophers, I don't know, like structure, system, for lack of a better conceptualization. And then it's up to, I guess, like rigorous critique to fill up what is lacking, what is not totalized by that system or by that structure.
Yeah, see, this still gives a very like Lacanian real almost vibe to what you're describing.
I think that at least the way that because we talked about this last time in the podcast about how Lyotard and everyone at the Sorbonne would be going to Lacan's lectures. And I think, if anything, Lyotard is closer, or I guess less doing a critique of Lacan and more flushing out the Freudianism in Lacan.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense. Yeah. Sort of like La Ruelle a little bit too. Mm-hmm. I think is doing like a similar approach.
One thing about the Great Zero that I've been trying to think through is this, the combination of de-intensification and sort of a cooling down, these metaphors that Lyotard used to describe it. And it's very complicated for me to think through this. So I'll just give like some of my thought processes, and I'm wondering what you guys have to think about. When I read this, it sort of calls to mind almost like the scientific principle of when molecules are moving faster or speeding up, there's heat involved. Yeah. And when they're slowing down, there's cooling.
Yeah, so, the thermodynamic sort of.
Exactly. And I sort of imagine it so far as, in order to sort of have a shot, or in order to sort of conceptualize the totality of a system, you kind of have to slow down the mechanisms of that system, where you get kind of a snapshot of a dynamic process of things
in that
moving.
Moment.
Right. But if you slow it down, you sort of get a conceptual volume, so to speak, of how the system's operating at that particular moment. But that doesn't mean that you can ever totalize the workings of that system. It's just that you get a snapshot about one particular interpretation of the totality itself. If that makes sense. So I'm interested to see how do you guys read that? Because that always sticks out to me, like those very direct metaphors of.
I had that same sort of thermodynamic picture of diffusion across a membrane that you sort of effectively described as well. That was definitely big in my mind.
If you want to go to the definition before the Great Zero, it's the bar. I think that's the way that I at least can conceptualize it. When I first started reading, I can read it if you want, Coop. If we imagine the libidinal band as having one surface, white-hot labyrinth and aleatory, then the bar is to be seen as the operator of de-intensification, which in slowing down allows the displaceability of non-identity, the drives, pulsions, and intensities to be arrested and given a designation and signification. It is through procedures of exclusion, notably negation and exteriorization, that the bar gives birth to the conceptual processes, twisting the band into what Lyotard calls the theatrical volume, dividing up what takes place on the band into this and not this. The bar, as it cools down, accounts for the series of conceptual frontiers which distinguish the ideal and the real, the authentic and the alienated, the useful and the exchangeable, the normal and the perverse, etc. It should be noted that for Lyotard, the bar and the band are nevertheless one and the same. When the bar rotates in a furious, aleatory fashion, we have something like the libidinal band. When the bar slows down, we have something like a theatrical volume. Why the bar slows down is a question of peculiar to representational thinking itself, an affect of the cooling bar. So I think you nailed it right on the head, Young. We don't know what causes the libidinal band to slow down or speed up, but it's during that process of speed up or slowdown, particularly when it's slowing down, that we get that theater of representation, you could say, or
Right.
that you create these complex systems, etc. And then it's when it's speeding up that you would get, I guess, like you could maybe call it the opposite. You would get the libidinal material intensities. I guess that would be more in line to what I would read out of like Deleuze and Guattari, at least their conceptualization of an intensity. But I think you had it right on the head right there.
That's really helpful. Yeah, that's super interesting. And like when the band speeds up and heats up, it sort of deconstructs the prior symbolic or the prior signification of a totality, which, that's super interesting. I was going to ask Taylor too, because that word aleatory comes up a lot. It's interesting. I understand it. And basically it's like chance, but in French, it seems when I looked it up and looked into it, it's roll of the dice chance, so to speak.
Yeah. So if you remember, he brings up, and we could pull this up, I think it's like page 3 or 4 into chapter 2. He talks about Caesar at the Rubicon, which is like this famous scene in ancient history, right? Where he's kind of told that, with his army, he's not allowed back into Rome. And if he crosses, there's going to be that civil war with the triumvirate. And he crosses the Rubicon. He crosses this river, which basically designates his intention, right? To use his, not just his armies, because he had a lot of political force too. He was very beloved, especially at the time. So yeah, here we go. He says, here we encounter the question of interest for tourism, where conquest is interested insofar as the expenditures, not only those of equipment and maintenance, but also effective expenditures, which are eventually very heavy, like Caesar at the Rubicon, are nothing more than advances insofar then as desire is lost, only the better recovered. So Caesar at the Rubicon says, alia jacta est, the die is cast. And so alia is literally the die or the dice and the game of chance. So something that's aleatory or aleatory it's haphazard in a way that involves chance in the highest sense, and literally like a rolling of the dice and also taking a chance. So something aleatory, when that just kind of means, and really, if we're thinking about the bar, aleatory in its furious rotation, that is very much like molecules bouncing. And so we have a concept of absolute zero where molecules are basically their self-vibration in a space. Their Brownian motion is the most stable in the sense in which it's dead. It's a dead system. There is no sort of randomness to it, no metastable equilibrium. So yeah, as we get higher and higher temperatures, we get more and more unpredictable movements. This furious kind of aleatory movement for the molecules, and it is a kind of freedom on the one hand from the molecular standpoint, but it also, like I brought up last time with I think of the cooling of the bar. If we think of libidinal economy, we're thinking of the velocity and intensity and even speed of these exchanges and these movements of intensities. I kind of thought about it last time when when Freud specifically is qualifying certain libidos as too viscous, right? And it's like they're almost too cold and they don't move. Everything sticks, and so nothing sticks. And then something that's too viscous, right? It might too intense or too unbound in a certain sense. Nothing sticks. And so Freud wants that, as I said, that Goldilocks thing. He wants it right where he can have his libidinal band and eat it too, right? He wants to bring in just a little dose of the great zero, but also keep the libido flowing in a way that allows for change. And I think that's really that interesting goal of schizoanalysis, when Guattari's like be right on the, straddle those frontiers, be right on the surface, and be kind of feeling out the waves, the shock waves, like a geologist would, or something like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful etymology too. Thank you for going into that. That really helps me. That's super interesting.
Quick question for Taylor, or I guess I'll open it up for you guys all, the way that maybe you guys read it. So in that sense, I guess the way that you described it, Taylor, do you guys see it as, if the speeding up the band, leads to higher and higher intensities, in a way that can be connected to the schizo, kind of everything signifies in a way, and then as it cools down, you get more of this rigid structuring of these totalizing systems. So now, in a way, is this like a micro critique of like a meta? I don't even want to say meta narratives, but like a meta, like the meta narrative of libido itself.
That's interesting. I mean, that's one way of thinking it. Bringing up the schizo, obviously, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's about the very thing that at least primitive societies, if not all societies, ward off, which is this unlimited decoding of flows. And so I think it's interesting to bring in a dialogue with Lyotard, who is talking about structuralism, throughout this book, including Levi-Strauss. He brought up Peirce with semiotics. I think he's thinking through Saussure, and he's qualifying, these structuralists as basically the enemy, right? As they are trying to basically do this thing where the code itself. I mean, this is why he goes back to Augustine and these other thinkers, the medieval thinkers, the Victorians, and he's trying to say that they found a new way to be pious, in the same way that Deleuze and Guattari talk about psychoanalysts. Like they found a new way to instantiate themselves as priests, and there's this aura of scientificity around linguistics that gives it this quasi-universalism to kind of insinuate itself in all the disciplines, at least the humanities proper. And I think that for Lyotard, this notion that there would be, he brings it up, I forget who he's directly attacking, but this notion that there would be this code that would precede the message to be deciphered into information with the addressee-addresser relationship, and that this code would both be sort of present in each of the series and yet eternally absent, preordained by God, or, with the Victorians, it's basically God himself, outside of the series, yet suffused through it all. I think that notion of this ever eliding a code that's both competently used by the senders and receivers to decode information, but at the same time, not belonging to any of them, and somehow, like the phallus that he brings up, like the Lacanian phallus, it's this transcendental signified that makes signification in the series, the chains of signification, possible by its very absence. That's that question of, if the schizo is on the far side of decoding, and then you have the barbarians and the savages, if that corresponds in terms of Lyotard, I don't know. I mean, they are working with similar sources, like Pierre Closter and this question of society against the state that he brings up. So I think their premises and their conclusions are actually different. So this actually gets to this thing where libidinal economy is the greatest, it's a great notion of the dissimilitude, the dissimulation and dissimulation that Lyotard talks about, because it's so close, it's so very close that it's to something like Anti-Oedipus, that it actually is quite different. And I think that it's good to keep bringing into dialogue so that we can be sensitive to those differences.
And then, sorry, just as a follow-up then, I guess in that way, could you see Anti-Oedipus as what it is, a critique of, these Oedipal structures? In a way, libidinal economy is more of to be kind of meme-ish here, an Oedipal realism, or an Oedipus, something like that?
It's, what does he say on that very first paragraph? Or maybe it's the second one. If we bring up the chapter, I'll look at it. What does he say? Yeah, at the top of 44, right? He brings up Freud, Lacan, old Husserl, right? He's already critiquing this Platonism of, this interior Platonism of linguistics. And he says, we say, no, there are only differences. And if there is meaning, is because there is a sign. If there is a sign, is because there is difference, not just any difference. One never passes haphazardly from one element to another. On the contrary, there is an organized voyage from one turn to another in extreme systematic or structural precision. And underneath it all, ultimately, if we have religious souls like Freud or Lacan, we produce the image of a great signifier, forever completely absent, whose only presence is absentification, reserve, and relief of the terms make signs of it, substitutes for each other, the image of a great zero, which keeps these terms disjunct, and which we will translate into libidinal economy under the name, unpronounceable, of course, of castrator. So here it's hard to tell, right? If he is proposing this, as you say, cute, this Oedipal realism as a foil, right? If it's, maybe that's what's kind of brought up, because it's precisely with Oedipus blinding himself, it's precisely that recognition that actually getting that bit of code to decode the chain of events and signifiers that lead to the very presence in his face of both incest and patricide, like in this one kind of intimately conjoined confluence. And it's obviously like his self-blinding is his castration, blah, 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 which is this interesting thing where it's almost like Lyotard is saying with Deleuze and Guattari, yes, we have to go through Oedipus, but there's more. I think that he's taking up their critique of linguistics and structuralism in a way that is his own, and that this is where we see that he's not necessarily proposing a new type of analytic machine in and of itself, right? He is, in a different sense, trying to formulate, one could even call them these different ways of creating investment machines and disinvestment machines.
Yeah, I like that.
So it's hard to say. It's hard to say if this is a foil or not. And he doesn't, I don't know, by this time in the text, has he even said the name Oedipus, or has it come up? Not
Explicitly. All that he's been like hinting at is just like the structures themselves.
Right.
So I guess that's the primary reason why I wanted to maybe bring that up or put it on the table for you guys, is just how exactly you guys are reading it. Because at least to me, it seems like it's sometimes a foil. I definitely get where you're coming from, and I don't want to say that he's exactly working within this Freudian or Lacanian tradition, but it does seem like he's not going about it the same way that Deleuze and Guattari are.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I get the sense that really Lacan is sort of secondary to Freud in terms of whom he's sort of the banner that Lyotard is camped out under, I think, in terms of his critique and describing ultimately the libidinal economy via the band and great skin and all of that.
Just to kind of like add to that, that's when I read it anyway, in terms of like his materialism. It's like if these material intensities these libidinal intensities, what exactly do they designate to? And it's like, well, they have to be these real, not real in that sense, but these concrete like material objects in a way. They don't sign or they don't point to anything, because like what we mentioned in the very first podcast, that sexuality or that sexual element or that erotic element of like an economy, right? Desires, they're material. They're not like, they don't have I guess they do, but they don't have this explicit like representation or the sign that you point to. It's precisely because they're desires that they manifest themselves, or they're produced materially, that they create these systems or structures, and then it's posteriorly one could say that the system is then interpreted or created to explain those libidinal structures or whatever.
It's pretty Hegelian as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
I love how he calls Freud and Lacan religious souls.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks a bit to like what Hugh was saying, like he's definitely working. It's not exactly correct to say he's working within the tradition of Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalysis. It's that he's working at like the edges of those traditions. He's trying to like speed up those molecules a little further, which I think is sort of the joke of religious souls like Freud or Lacan, who he says produce this image of a great signifier that's always absent. He's interested in how like Lacan, Freud, or any thought system for that matter, sort of draws its own limitations and says, here's the extent to my entire metaphysics of everything. The great signifier, the big other, the whatever you want to call it, is sort of like where they drew their limits. And now the goal is to sort of push those limits further, so to speak, to heat things up a bit and to sort of like detach that religiosity, that religious absence aspect from the analysis itself.
So in a way, is libidinal economy then what, if you're using the metaphor of the libidinal band as like an explicit, like the rhizome, that's 1,000 plateaus, the libidinal band is then libidinal economy as a book, if that makes sense? Like it's using like, this systemic critique or rationality or whatever you want to call it explicitly, but at the same time, it's like flushing out a libidinal diagram in a way, or like diagramming those intensities.
Yeah, that sounds right. Because he was definitely drawing on Freud and Lacan as far as like their topological work that I think I brought up quite a bit in episode 1.
Thought it was interesting. He seems on page 45 when he's going through what structuralism does with the sign and talking about how there's just, in going into this perpetual, he calls it the postponement of the signifier. And obviously Derrida has this notion of différance, which is both difference and deferral, right? In French, those words are linked. So to differ something is also to defer it, usually in a more. So that's why he talks about the postponement of the signifier. It's always in this endless, chain.
Deference, yeah.
Yeah, but then down below, he starts to sound a lot like Guattari when he says, this is kind of towards the top middle. He says, there is no sign or thought of the sign which is not about power and for power. The voyage of the search is not the drift of the mad and the plague-stricken, nor the transspatial exodus of the uncanny. It is the well-prepared flight of the explorer, foreshadowing that of the priest, then the soldier, and the businessman. It is the avant-garde of capital, which is itself already simply capital insofar it is the perpetual activity of pushing back its frontiers. Again, that's anti-Oedipus theory. The incorporation of yet more new pieces of the band into its system, but incorporation with a view to revenue to yielding a return. And, in that opening chapter of the Machine of Conscious, Guattari, says linguists are imperialists. They're not the only ones, they're not the first ones, but that's essentially what's at stake, is this kind of territorialization of really kind of the standard movements of not just thinking, but obviously this kind of movement of capital, of incorporating, and you can imagine what you're saying, like, you will be made to signify, you will be adjusted, you will be like institutionalized, for lack of grammaticality. And so that's also, there's a jurisprudence there's a flow of like jurisprudence that's already sort of one in the same in this movement of exploitation that Lyotard is bringing out here.
I think there's also, you can start to see why he would call this his evil book, or start to see sort of the easy jump you can make to sort of see capital as, what Deleuze and Guattari calling like deterritorializing force, or for Lyotard sort of to see that capital is sort of this very effective mechanism for incorporating the outside into the inside in almost like a radical avant-garde way. And there's this sort of mistake you can make to say, well, then capital is itself a revolutionary force because it's constantly sort of finding something new. That's not necessarily what Lyotard wants to say, but it's an easy jump to make by following his logic. I think the distinction, though, is that he's doing something about sort of the meta dynamics of how the outside is incorporated to the inside, or how, philosophy and psychoanalysis conceptualizes itself, where deterritorialization might be good as a function, but that doesn't mean that capital is good because it deterritorializes. It's just that capital itself is a good example of how deterritorialization, or how that function of incorporation, can happen. It's sort of like this almost metaphorical tool, and not something that, well, you could easily do this, but to sort of like make capital into a religion of sorts. You can fall into that sort of the same religiosity that he pejoratively identifies other philosophers with Lyotard himself, and sort of saying that, well, actually the new big signifier is just capital.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the new thing.
Right.
It's material, but it's still at the limits of conceptualization that he draws earlier.
That's very good.
This almost reminds me of Kant Capital and the prohibition of incest, in the way that it's, as you stated, it's almost always like capital incorporates the outside, and it always takes like the foreign into the paper. The way that Land talks about it is that, we always come about the outside as something which we already have our preconceptions about. So that's what he would note as the a priori. In the same way, it's like, if we already have this, capital, the capital C as like the great revolutionary force, then I guess I'm confident to side with Land in that sense, that it's like we haven't overcome this Kantian transcendental limit, or at least this way of thinking. Though I guess like the way that you flushed it out already, about like how you totalize like the outside and already incorporate it as part of the inside, as part of already existing knowledge. So there's nothing ever truly new. That's the whole notion of a synthetic a priori.
Yeah, exactly.
He does get into Sade directly a bit later on in the chapter. And I'm also curious, I think maybe the discussion later on in the chapter is more so the Lacan. I forget what the title of Lacan's work with Sade. I think it's just Kant and Sade, right?
Yeah,
Kant,
Kant and Sade, I think.
Kant with Sade, or Kant avec Sade.
That's in a Cree, right? Like
I believe so.
one of the first, Kant and
Kant
Sade,
with
the ideal couple. Oh no, that's the Zizek one on.
Yeah, it's with Sade,
but it's Kant with Sade. You're right.
It's a good essay. I mean, I think it has a lot. I think it's a very important essay, and it's one of the more accessible ones for Lacan. You know, he does a good job at the stakes of the question of like jouissance, and the question of being a functionary of the state, and you know, whether one's pleasure, quote unquote, one's jouissance is related to fulfilling that function or related to this more sadistic, you know, I take pleasure because I kill, not because I'm ordered to kill, right? Of the executioner. So I love that essay, and I think it has a lot to do with what we're seeing in this chapter.
Yeah.
But Kant's whole thing with Sade, though, is that he, as like his whole transgressive program, or what, if you want to call it that, or like his whole thing with transgression is that that transgression is sort of reifying the state, or he's more moral in a sense or he's the most moral in that sort of framework.
Yeah.
Through his transgression, by like his sort of this self-defeating attempt to transgress by that's what sort of reifies this state somehow, and I forget. Yeah.
There's actually there's a really interesting book by Giorgio Agamben called The Highest Poverty, where he makes a similar point exactly to what you're saying, Coop, where he draws on, the whole book is about like monastic life as the perfect form of life, whereas, you know, your ideas about life get directly translated into action or how to live your life. And he talks about how that concept is shown in its negative when he talks about the Thelemites, who were a religious group that wanted to be completely transgressive, and they basically did like Marquis de Sade style, you know, sexual chaos, so to speak, or at least they said it was chaos, or like the Marquis de Sade is sort of like this supposedly great deterritorialization of, you know, sexual taboos and everything. But Agamben's point is, you know, look at Marquis de Sade, or, you know, like even I think Pasolini's 120 Days of Sodom is a great sort of translation of this. But these people who are engaging in this like supposedly chaotic sexual energy have so many rules associated with it. The sort of like complete transgressive action of sort of not having monastic life, trying to do its opposite, is just as much a form of life. It has just as many, if not more, rules about its own chaos than like a highly formed monastic or like any form. So the transgression of the form is oftentimes the sort of reification of those same rules, just on the opposite end, like you're saying. Like it could be the state. The complete negation of the state does not fully escape the form that it's trying to. It sort of reifies those forms in new ways while disillusioning itself or illusioning itself to the fact that it's just chaos, or thinking that it's just chaos, when in reality it follows strict form.
The broad strokes of the book, and where it differs from something like Anti-Oedipus, is that I don't think Lyotard tries to make a judgment that there's a positive expression of desire. So I don't know how that squares with this sort of Sadean reference, because unless it's like this just argument of capitalism as this ultimate deterritorializing force, but having no, I don't like that sort of being the end, like that being it. Like it's not, it simply is this deterritorializing force that will dominate, or this sort of like imperialistic thing. But I don't know.
I think if I just tying in, the sort of tangent about a Agamben thing is, like you're saying, like to the outside observer, or to the inside observer, I should say, capitalism and the processes of deterritorialization appear to be chaos, or just ununderstandable things, the outside sort of making its way on the inside without being comprehended. While at the same time, deterritorialization itself, and I think that's what Lyotard is trying to do, is sort of start to piece out the actual form, the actual process, and how it operates, showing that it's not just pure chaos. There are rules, there are mechanisms at play here that are understandable, even though they're not understandable right now with our conceptual toolkits.
That was sort of the question I was asking in the first episode. I lost my train of thought. But I asked, say that again.
What I was just saying, the stuff about form. It's almost like the libidinal economy is sort of trying, or is sort of taking seriously the actual form, the actual weighs the process itself, trying to understand it instead of just saying, oh, like capitalism just creates chaos. Deterritorialization is just complete chance chaos. Instead, It's sort of saying like, even though this thing we identify as chaos, like as pure outside,
right,
we can still, using the limits of our conceptual toolkits, look at it and actually theorize how it operates, just like you could theorize, just as the chaos of sort of sex orgy form is understandable, has a logic to it, even though to the monastic priest, it just seems like pure chaos or pure the exact opposite of form itself.
Okay, so what I was thinking about in that context was that's the critique sort of libidinal economy would be, how is there any kind of plane of consistency if it's all just this sort of chaotic deterritorialization process,
right,
force or whatever with libido and desire? Like, how do we have any stable, if it's all this libidinal economics that are sort of underlying everything, then how do we have any kind of, how is reality not just pure chaos?
This brings us back to an interesting concept we find in Kant, this notion of what does he call it? I think he calls it a Vernunftsglaube, which is basically like a faith of reason, or a reason, or a faith in reason, even, if you will. Like, we have to have this minimal faith, this minimal belief in we could just say the transcendental field created by reason, such that there is, such that we can even grasp information coming from the minimum faith that keeps all thought and even all ontology from falling into chaos and just being randomness. I forget the name of the essay that it's probably something really boring, about the faith of reason, this reason faith, this minimal faith. Obviously, Kant uses some of that to displace the macro faith that Descartes has to start his system with there is a God, he does not deceive, etc. And, Kant wants to prevent that. But obviously, he's slipping in God through the back door in all different areas, including this little area where, you don't say God, but you might as well just, that you have to have this minimal belief in God so that
That's
this,
funny.
Right.
you know what I mean? This creative principle or this organizing principle.
Non.
Yeah.
Well, right. So without which you would merely have chaos, nothing would consist. And for Guattari, he's interested more in how we can theorize different regimes of consistency from the abstract to the molecular and the molar, and therefore bypass this question. I mean, he calls it a radically atheist creationism. It's almost this contradiction in terms, obviously, but for him, the creationism is inherent to this theorization of abstract machines and the plane of immanence, and not to this thing we need to posit beforehand before we can say, okay, things consist. Yeah. We can think.
Right. Gotcha.
But isn't it also precisely because of the intensification and the desensitification of the band that you have these structures? So it's not that, desire produces that anything goes or whatever, or that you have this pure chaos. It's because you have this pure chaos that can be rendered, you could say, intelligible through these systems, that you can make them structures, or you can even say something like all economies are libidinal. It's precisely because you can have, these structures, Freudian terms, it's, Freud's interpretation of dreams, it's they have a structure. And Lacan's notion of desire, it's lack, they have these rigid designated systems, but precisely because the moment that you start overextending those rigid designating systems, that's when you need to, introduce or back-end it with affectivity, with libidinal intensities. You need to provide that support or critique, you could say.
Yeah.
Now, Coop, you brought up the tensor. Are we do we want to read through this to make sense of the title of the chapter?
Yeah, I do want to, since it's the title of the chapter, and I think it may clarify perhaps some of the later work that he's doing, I think with the Klosowski and some of the other literary readings or references that Lyotard's bringing up. And because I think offhand, it's not super clear to me necessarily where the tensor, so why he chose that title for the chapter, but hopefully this will open up the floor. The tensor It is in his description of the tensor that Lyotard combats most directly the nihilism that he takes to be inherent in all semiotics, structuralism in particular. Signs form part of the theatrical dispositif, subordinating intensities, actions, or emotions, for example, to a lac, whether this lac can be considered in terms of a signified or another signifier to which a sign refers in order to have a semiotic value. The sign refers or defers itself to an elsewhere, constitutively replacing something that's absent for someone. Lyotard's wish to reintroduce into the sign a tension that prevents it from having either a unitary designation, meaning, or calculable series of such designations or meanings would also be referred to as polysemia, is an attempt to block this movement, a referral and refrain, and remain as faithful as possible to the incompossible intensities informing and exceeding the sign. The tensor sign is a description of this attempt. The latter is not, therefore, a move beyond representation, the creation of an elsewhere outside the sign, for the idea of the tensor would then simply repeat the rules of the dispositif, which organizes the possibility of signs in the first place. Signs are also tensors, indissociably singular, vain intensities in flight. Signs dissimulate tensors.
I mean, this is pretty cool. I know that in 1,000 Plateaus, which will come out, 5 years later, they also discuss tensors in terms of language. Let's see, this is, in the postulate linguistics, they'll talk about a cutting edge of deterritorialization of language, which is found in the atypical expression, and it plays the role of tensor. In other words, it causes language to tend toward the limit of its elements, forms, or notions toward a near side or a beyond of language. The tensor affects a kind of transitivization of the phrase, causing the last term to react upon the preceding term back through the entire chain. So they're thinking about it in terms of like a resonance. And, mathematically, obviously, that's where the term tensor comes from in the 60s. It's, it was kind of coined to build off of this work done in vector spaces and things like that. And the best way that I talked to my father, a mathematician, and he described tensors in a very like intuitive way to me. But the best way I would think about it is like tensors they're describing these multilinear relations between algebraic objects in a vector space. And so, the basic definition of a vector is this object that describes relations that have magnitude and direction, right? So I think that that's the interesting thing about what Lyotard is bringing in here when he's talking about signs and tensors, and this question of that it's not just this simple deferral and postponement, right? That there is this aspect of intensity because you have directionality and you have magnitude, and you can actually add tensors and vectors together and scale them. And I think that that's what he's thinking of in this way that would keep it from being a mere kind of any sort of either simply linear or simply theologically infused understanding through simulacra, like with Augustine, where all the signs are like pointed up towards some absent present sign like God or whatever that guarantees their space. As Q brought up earlier, this notion of tensor spaces with signs. It's very much in dialogue with the notion of rhizome, and I could see Lyotard and Deleuze just kind of talking about this, probably even like in the mathematical side, because in Difference Repetition, Deleuze has got that really deep chapter on the infinitesimal calculus, right? And I can see the two of them nerding the fuck out talking about this shit.
It's interesting to think about trying to relate this to sort of structuralism, and even I think it sort of critiques a part of post-structuralism. So this is sort of like a major metaphor I've used to understand what's going on here. So like structuralism being sort of in de Saussure's structuralist linguistics being the argument that language is synchronic instead of diachronic, meaning that like, you can only understand a language when you have like all of its pieces ahistorical to wherever you are. You can only understand words in relation to each other. If you think of language systems as like a solar system, the structuralist project would say, well, look, all of these things we can understand when we map it all out, and that map will be sort of like a one-to-one relationship from sign to what is signified. And then you have Derrida, which I would consider post-structuralism to a large extent, saying, well, so you have this map and you have this series of meaning, but it's based on centering certain terms, sort of. And by centering them, you're sort of like saying that we know what those are, and that's sort of like the dispositif of those entire system. The planets orbit a sun, right? And the sun is centered. And Derrida would say, well, no, the sun isn't necessarily what has to be centered. You can sort of redraw these lines, right? Like there's an infinite amount of play in sort of drawing the connections between these different planets, so to speak, or concepts or words. But then there's a further sort of deconstruction, or what Lyotard is sort of getting at. I think Nick Land described really well in his critique of Derrida. He has an essay on Träckel's poetry, and he describes it as, so keeping with the solar system sort of metaphor, yes, like you can decenter things and draw different meanings given this synchronic system of language and meaning, but all these stars are also intensifying, de-intensifying, diffusing as that's happening. So structuralism, when it says that, like there's a one-to-one relation, we can understand the solar system. It can only understand that at one particular moment in time where everything is completely de-intensified. The stars aren't moving, they're not blowing up, they're not doing these things. But sort of the libidinal materialist post-structuralism is sort of revealing that you can never truly map out those stars without making the illusion that they're not moving, so to speak. You can't do it without pretending that the solar system is sort of just a firmament, so to speak. Even in Derrida's sort of like firmament that can be reconstructed in certain ways is not entirely true. There's another step to say that all of this is dynamic. It's constantly changing in intensity. It's constantly changing in its relation to other objects in the system. And so I see it as like, there's one critique of structuralism, but there's even a critique of the Derridian vein of post-structuralism. It's making those signs, it's trying to draw attention to the fact that those signs are highly material and highly intense, and not just sort of like these things that can just have a one-to-one signification in an asynchronic system. Does that make sense? That's like my most complex metaphor, I think.
I think that's helpful. And yeah, you'll see early on in this chapter, I think it was page 47, or page 46 at the bottom, right below where he talks about Caesar at the Rubicon. He says, another consequence then, with the sign, if we have intention and postponement, we also have the opening up of diachrony, which is only a drawing out of the tense of the compact immobile tensor into an always past and a still to come, and even now and a not yet, into the game of de-presence, the very game of semiotic nihilism. And then he goes on about the sign. But yeah, that notion of a semiotic nihilism is interesting, coming from him, and he'll definitely later on he'll bring up Augustine again in his dispute or his diatribe against Pharaoh, and you kind of see replayed seemingly this fight between Plato and the sophists, right? With Augustine and Varro, it is about this question of a political future for Rome, or for the Roman people, out of this kind of pagan past, and like the only true kind of future has to be guaranteed in a new theory of language grounded in this idea of simulacrum, of similitude, anchored in God or the Godhead, the Great Zero, I guess. Have you guys read The Case of Dora? Have you guys read this case that he's talking about with Freud, one of his first? Yeah,
I wrote my master's thesis on.
Hell yeah! Well, that's good. I remember studying this in a psychoanalysis class, and I really do think that this is what's interesting about the case. I think here that I would bring up with Lyotard talking about the hysteric body and the kind of the signs of the body, like her coughing, etc. What I learned from about Freud in his writing of the notes most was that I don't think until this case study he really had a solid grasp on conceptualizing counter-transference.
Yes.
He may have been aware of it, but he may have been aware of it like intuitively, but it does seem to be where he finally is able to kind of articulate it and at least acknowledge that it is working, that there is this counter-transference from the analyst back onto the analysand, and I think that that's where I would bring that up only to try to point towards this case, the Schreber case, right? This question of Schreber and the solar anus and wanting to repopulate humanity by sort of giving birth to God's children, right? And the Dr. Fleshig. So you got Schreber and Fleshig, and Lyotard seems to try to dramatize both Schreber's transferences, but also this, the singular proper name of Fleshig, and its conjunction with God and these other things, and how there is potentially this counter-transference going on, and this little. So I like how Lyotard kind of brings up Schreber to work through some of the same things he's already been critiquing in terms of theology, in terms of like Augustine and Varro and the Roman theology and all this stuff. What did you guys think about the Schreber stuff? I mean, it's another tie to anti-Oedipus, obviously.
Just a footnote too, when you're talking about counter-transference, the Freudian idea of counter-transference being the imposition on the patient by the analyst their own emotional or conceptual sort of understanding. That's sort of like they're imposing their own emotions or thoughts about the case onto the patient. Just to footnote it.
Yeah, and it forms Guattari talks about it in terms of a transferential assemblage, right? There is this assemblage that's kind of has a life of its own, that takes on a life of its own as these libidinal investments get put into the talking cure and the whole montage, the whole setup of the whole scenery, right, of the staging of the unconscious revealing itself. And I think that's kind of why with Schreber we have something, that's so unprecedented in terms of, it's obviously got, it could have a full-fledged Foucauldian reading. I'm sure there's a million of them out there, because it is this guy who is well-to-do. He runs his own affairs financially fine, right? But he has this intense, obviously for him, real experience and belief and faith in this future to come, that he's going to be the mother of creation. And so he's institutionalized, but he's obviously, in all other aspects of his life, he's obviously very cognizant of his affairs. He's able to, as I said, he's able to run his household, and he's able to, be a well-adjusted citizen in all these other aspects, even to the point of being able to write his own memoirs and to be able to articulate this complex. And yet he is sort of deemed unfit for, freedom outside of these institutions. And so there is this interesting singularity. There's also a kind of injustice done to him as well, and that's why I think this interesting, Lyotard is fascinated with this question of what's behind Schreber's stupidity of being too stupid to shit, right? Which is
he had a lot of libidinal investment in his anus, in
57
and the diarrhea. That was
right.
A major part of his.
Well, that gets back to the intensification and disintensification of the bar, right? Or the viscous libido versus the libido that's too fluid, right? Nothing can stick. So the different flows, the blockage of the flows and the overflowing. Yeah. So on 57 at the bottom, that's where the pen almost shrinks from recording so monumental a piece of absurdity as that God, blinded by his ignorance of human nature, can possibly go to such lengths as to suppose that there can exist a man too stupid to do what every animal can do, too stupid to be able to shit. I
think it was interesting what you were saying earlier about countertransference, because I think that the Schreber case is very interesting when thinking about libidinal economy, because it's sort of a case of countertransference that leads to a libidinal misinterpretation. Being one of the major things is Freud thinks that Schreber, one of his things is because he used to sleep as a baby where his parents had sex.
Right.
And thinks that that's probably sort of libidinally responsible for something. But it's actually, at least we're fairly certain that that's a major countertransference on Freud's part, because Schreber grew up in like a different part of Austria or a different part than what Freud is from.
Mm-hmm.
And that particular culture didn't have the baby sleep with them at night. They would be in a separate room. But Freud sort of makes this countertransference of like how German babies are raised, how he was raised, being like, he probably saw his parents having sex early, and now I can draw this like libidinal connection between this and that. But it shows that libido is always far more complicated and far more intense than the libidinal interpretation of it. You know, we're always kind of putting a countertransference of sorts. Countertransference in this case just being the limits of our own knowledge to understand libido sort of leads us to misinterpret the intensity of what we're feeling.
Yeah, it's a kind of horizon of prejudice that comes to blind oneself and comes to like kind of cover over everything. And I do think it's interesting you bring that up, because Freud is always seemingly in search of this primal scene where where like the trauma of becoming an ego, becoming a sexuated body, etc., can explain through this latency period of, you know, adolescence to the sort of rush of hormones and the possibility of reproduction. It can tell the tale of the pathologies of the subject in question. And I think that goes back to why Lyotard keeps bringing up this language of setting a stage, of a scenery, of a theatricalization that not only linguists perpetrate, but also, you know, already what Freud and even Lacan will fall back on. And so there's this question of the scenery that would dominate that initial trauma to explain it all. Again, I think that Freud, obviously there's that kernel of truth. And yet there is this misapplication or this overestimation, or this, again, as you said, bringing in these unconscious biases and prejudices from his own life and overcoding. Because if I remember correctly, he doesn't work with Schreber personally, right? He just reads the memoirs.
Yeah.
So I mean, already there you get that one distance removed, and you got to fill in that kind of lack of direct access. And so, you know, I'm sure that, you know, it's not like, oh, Freud fucked up. It's like, how could any of us not, in that setting and with the stakes so high, right? With this, it's still, I mean, psychoanalysis at the time was still in its early infancy, so you have to take these risks. How would anyone not fail to bring in one's own sort of angles and ways of, you know, understanding ourselves and sort of plate it on in different areas and cover over a lot of things that just would seem very absurd to any everyday human being. I think that there's something very explosive about Schreber's disruption of binaries that Lyotard is going through, right? The body man, body woman, etc. This, I mean, this is on the same page, right? Where he says, second remark, this stupidity turns up again in the strange notion of femininity well, I guess that might be the next page. Sorry, that's 58, my bad. Implied by Schreber's text quoted above, there is woman rather than being woman. This there is being indifferently translated by behave like the woman in coitus, and also behave like this woman's man, playing the part of a woman lying in my own sexual embraces. And then at the end, he's talking about Flechsig as the predicate of several statements which imply that under it, incompossible pulsions are activated together. Shall we say that, right? And he says, Flechsig loves me since he makes me shit come. Flechsig hates me since he forbids me to shit come. I love it that Flechsig should hate me because my own persecution is necessary in order that I may accomplish the salvation of future humanity. I hated that Flechsig loves me, for I would like defecation to be as natural for me as it is for others. So you do have this, again, this sort of disjunction that's going on at the same time, and it causes Schreber to be, as he says above, a body without regulated organic functions, a sexless or multi-sexed body. Right? It is that both at the same time, although that or gets established, that exclusive disjunction gets established with the cooling down of the bar and the band, etc.
How much does this have to do with something like, and Proust and Signs Deleuze is saying, don't mistake the signs for the signified? Is there a similar relation with transference? Or is that too?
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, I think that in Freudian language, it might be something like, don't mistake one's own symptoms, i.e., one's own ontogenesis, phylogenesis of our psychical apparatus, the whole history of events that sort of make us quote unquote well-adjusted egos, and then universalize that, right? Because I think that that's part of why Oedipus constitutes this pinnacle of sort of Freudian universalism, where it is about saying, okay, I trace back to its origin the plight of, destined for all men and therefore disjunctively all women. This question of a sort of overthrowing the primordial father, but at the same time in that very act, like establishing this law that shall never be possible again. This question of, I think that with Freud, he realizes, that I think in that, you see that his own self-analysis and his own ways of relating to that his formation of his psychical apparatus, it's easier if it were, because then psychoanalysis would have an Archimedean lever to sort of lift all of the weight for every patient. And so there is something admirable and really ambitious with Freud wanting to stake the wager on Oedipus. And I think that failure to consider that libido, desire, the ontogenesis, the psychogenesis of an individual is not so easy and not so simple. Yeah. And this is, I think, partly why Deleuze and Guattari start with machines. They start with even like the basic machine, the social mega machine, which has men as parts, and they go through how, psychic and social repression are interweaved, and that, the family nuclear mommy, daddy, me triangle is this Freudian, less fantasy, but more of an expedience, right? It's an expedient to reduce everything to those relations and not to consider the openness that we're already sort of assailed from the outside, even if we're remote and never see another person. There is still this kind of transcendental field of strangers, and Robinson Crusoe is where I would go with that, or what you guys have seen Castaway, right? That's a whole like libidinal monograph or whatever. Anyway,
through Freud's expediency, he's sort of trapped us in the scene of Oedipus. We can only act out our libidos in this very limited space that Freud sort of opened up as the entire possibility of libidinal interpretation. And people like Lyotard and Deleuze and Guattari are trying to leave the theater or just build a new one with whatever representation they can. But it's pretty incredible how Oedipus has come to be so almost totalizing in its role for interpreting our desire and our libidos.
It's like trying to get rid of that like indispensable node, right? So it's like this, just that structure, that very structure that already confines or limits libido to, like, as you already mentioned, like the theater or like this play that we are already within.
Mise en scene.
I was talking about the etymology of libido. It basically is related to the word for love, and Freud popularized it after, which I haven't read. Have you guys looked at any of Psychopathologia Sexualis? I only know about it secondhand. Okay, yeah.
Who wrote it? Freud?
No, Kraft-Ebing. It's a famous book that basically details quote unquote sexual perversions in a now pseudo medical context, but in the its intention was to be medically.
Wait, what is it called?
Psychopathia Sexualis. So PS.
When was that written?
1892 is what it says here. Although that's the English, maybe that's...
Yeah, I was going to say, is that the... Because I think I did hear, but I only passively in my history of sexuality class. There was like a Victorian era book that they try to like classify. Like they even try, like that's where the term, maybe not explicitly, but homosexuality comes from now.
It does.
Like its early origins.
Yeah, it has a special emphasis on male homosexuality, the antipathic instinct. It was published in German in 1886, so I guess it's translation into English is 6 years later in 1892. It's basically one of the first texts about sexual pathology with the subtitle, quote, with special reference to the antipathic sexual instinct. So its main subject would be then about homosexuality, male homosexuality. It's one of the earliest works on homosexuality, and it concludes that most homosexuals have a mental illness caused by degenerate heredity. Now, I think if Freud ever cites this book, and I don't remember if he does, but obviously in the 3 essays on sexuality, which I talked about last time, his main wager is that different perversions, whether it be homosexual or not, are not about heredity, right? It's not about a kind of genetic phylogenesis and destiny, but about, we have to understand psychogenesis, right? We have to understand where we start off as infants. We're polymorphously perverse. We don't have like erogenous zones that are centered around the genitals. Like the whole body is a conflux of partial objects that all have equal erogenous value.
Potentiality.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's only later as we quote unquote become a person, as you know, we're not born with an ego, right? As the psychical apparatus starts to form, that we can then say those erogenous zones more and more become centralized around the genitals. But Freud still wants to say that's not necessarily just a biological, function. It's also sociological.
Have you seen, there's a clip, it's kind of a meme, where Jordan Peterson tries to talk about how, why he thinks like the foot fetish is a thing. And then he's like, well, the region of the brain that's like, there's a region of the brain that's like responsible for like foot feeling or mobility or whatever. It's like really close to like the erogenous zone, like in the brain or whatever. And so he's like, that's where it comes from, and blah blah. And it's like, bro, it reminds me of that thing that you mentioned last time about like the nose, how it had a connection to the what's it called, the penis or whatever. And it's like, bro, you're extending this analogy way too far.
Yeah.
Doing reflexology and shit.
Yep.
Right. And it's interesting. Freud talks about noses and shit. And, when I was reading the Schreber thing, I had to go back to Oedipus, where they talk about the anus is the first organ to be privatized, right? That it's disinvested collectively and made private, because I don't know if you guys saw that little quote I had from Oedipus the other day about women riveted with vaginas, a big collective penis for the men. They talk about the anus, the privatization of the anus to be sort of extracted from the collective social field is the model upon which the phallus, etc., and then capital or money, because of the flows of money, they kind of take on after this model. And I almost feel like it allows them to end either that paragraph or the next with the Artaud quote that all writing is pig shit, right? And I can't tell, right, how serious they are about, or if it's just a big joke, or both, right? Or if it's kind of both. I think that when they tell jokes, sometimes I feel like it's a rarity. So where were we? I guess we were just kind of floating. We're
riffing a little bit on Schreber predominantly.
Yeah, we were talking about Schreber, right? And Freud, yeah.
The other thing about the Schreber case, and I think this can go hand in hand or start a conversation about the idea of simulation and sort of the thingness of signs. I think what's interesting about Schreber and about sort of like schizophrenia, say, generally, is it's sort of the outside making its way into the inside. And that's why schizophrenics, I think, are sort of relegated to the outside of society. I think the sort of schizophrenic impulse is very much ahead of its time in that it's a logic and it's a systematizing that is only in reference to itself. It's almost like the fourth level of simulation that Baudrillard talks about, or even Lyotard, where the sign has no reference to like what was originally being referred to. I think the schizo and Schreber, it sort of like scares us, being like society itself, when dealing with this type of logic because it's sort of at the highest level of simulation where we don't really have anything to grab onto and say, oh, I know what you're talking about. Like this referent we both share. The schizo is sort of trapped in the pure materiality, the pure like thingness, this representing itself of language, you know?
Perpetual signification in a way. Constantly making connections to that whole meme. It's like the schizo is sitting in the corner of the room, excited that, you know, they saw the number 13 because it connects to blah, blah, blah. Like making a whole sensical worldview out of that is like completely logical, completely structured, but it only makes sense in their own self-referential order.
Right.
Of science.
And it's almost like a hyperbolic version of all logic and representation too. It's just that we sort of are better at, Freud called it in like the dream, the idea of a stopgap, sort of like we were talking about earlier, the sort of like illogical hole in the dream that you can't really explain, but holds the whole thing together. That sense of suspense. And the schizo is just like, has that stopgap, and to us it seems so apparent because it doesn't make any sense to us. But when we see ourselves reflected in that, we sense that fear that there's always a stopgap in our own worldview, our own interpretation of ourselves and of the world.
I think Freud even brings it up. Let me search. I think the word is called ananke, but it's this, ananke stenai, which is like, it's got to stop at some point. I know Aquinas brings it up, but he gets it from Aristotle that to prevent thinking to have this infinite regress, there has to be a stopping point. There has to be something that, and I think that brings me back a little bit to what Kant talked about, you know, with the faith of reason, right? That that's like the minimal stopgap to allow consistency of thought.
Yeah.
And I could have sworn Freud uses ananke in the notion of ananke in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but maybe now no, it's in Civilization and its Discontents. Okay. Ananke is force, constraint, necessity. And obviously in this text, the notion of force and, Ian Hamilton Grant, he's oftentimes translating puissance instead of as power, as force. And where does he say? Freud says, we can only be satisfied, therefore, if we assert that the process of civilization is a modification which the vital process experiences under the influence of a task that is set for it by eros and instigated by ananke, right, which is necessity or force, or by the exigencies of reality, and that this task is one of uniting separate individuals into a community bound together by libidinal ties. Well, I almost feel like that sentence begs to be, actually doesn't say a lot. It requires a lot of unpacking there. But it obviously follows from Freud, the way he starts off the book by basically saying, like, sort of civilization got us past, some of the basic threats to our life. And so that's kind of why men banded together in the first place. But he doesn't go back into the killing the primordial father as much in that book. That's almost assumed, I think.
Oop, was it you that last time brought up what is Baudrillard's book called?
Symbolic Exchange and Death.
Exchange and Death. Yep. That one is Baudrillard's attempt at kind of like this type of theory. Yeah,
absolutely. It's this confluence of semiotics, political economy, and what else? What else would you call it? I guess psychoanalysis. Right. We've got Anti-Oedipus in 72, this in 74, and then Symbolic Exchange and Death in 76. And I think you can even see the influence slightly here on Baudrillard, and I think in particular in the discussion of Simulacra.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually where Baudrillard really gives the best layout of Simulacra, or simulation as well, rather than the book, the popular book that everyone says to read, which I think is like kind of meh. It's definitely not his best book at all.
No, yeah.
But you see a lot of overlap for sure. At least in terms of just the general, like I said, that kind of three-pronged approach of psychoanalysis, semiotics, and, more or less like a rough political economy.
I think this is page 69, which is kind of awesome. He says at that bottom paragraph, and I'll wait on you This is where he brings up Augustine. I'll just read a little bit.
Simulacrum?
Yeah, he says this is where the Augustinian thesis of the simulacrum takes up its position, the thesis of generalized similitude, that is to say, the basis of every semiotics, or at least every metaphorics. Everything is what it is because each thing resembles another thing, and given this, there must be a resemblance, a similitude, by participation in which all similar things are similar. And he says, Augustine calls this relationship, it's the word, and obviously you have that trinity of the Holy Spirit, Son, and the Father, all that. I like this. Obviously, what I like in Lyotard pointing this out and putting this forward is that this critique, and obviously I didn't read that here, but he's obviously critiquing Augustinian semiotics in this theological vein, this nihilistic theology. He is doing this kind of stuff, obviously gets him in the same league as Deleuze in different repetition, but also with Foucault, right, in the order of things. And so, like, I feel like this kind of, whether we call this post-structuralism or not, which is which I don't think necessarily is helpful here. I mean, but this critique of structuralism is, at least paves the way for that, or continues that in a different vein than what we already see in the other thinkers I brought up.
I think it's funny that this quote here, he says, the son or word is the simulacrum in itself. If it is true that the image or the simulacrum relationship between the two terms has to be one not only of similitudo, but of engenderment. The son, exactly like the father, is also what emanates from him. I don't know if this is, but there's that Baudrillard quote, the simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none. The simulacrum is true. And I'm like wondering if Baudrillard was inspired by that very sentence or something.
Well, he definitely draws on Augustine, that original theory of simulacrum.
Plato had a simulacrum discussion as well, right? Or am I wrong?
No, yeah.
Right. I think Deleuze is the one that uses that, if I'm remembering correctly, that definition of simulacrum.
Is that indifference in repetition?
It could be an essay that he writes, or that he wrote separately.
I think it's an appendix to Logic of Sense.
Logic, yeah.
That's the one you're talking about. Yeah, it's Plato's Sophist, where he brings up the two different ways of making images, and but obviously, like, whether or not he uses that word, the theory of simulacra is pretty much all throughout Plato. You can see it in the reasoning for why he kicks out the poets and the other artists from the Republic.
Which is really funny because that's like the last section of symbolic death or symbolic exchange and death is all sort of poetics as this praxis against the state or capitalism or whatever. Like that's his program is sort of revolves around poetics entirely.
I was just going to mention, I mean, that just reminds me of the thing that we brought up last time about how Lyotard, Deleuze, and Guattari are all writing as, using like the text itself as a revolutionary force. So Baudrillard's just following in that same line of flight, you could say.
I think maybe the place to wrap up, because I think it has a lot of red meat in terms of actually interrogating libidinal economy through like sex work and prostitution is kind of a large focus of the book, or this chapter of the book, I think. So just to draw on this chapter or this paragraph where he's talking about Mary Magdalene. The prostitute accepts prostitution in the name of a superior interest. She wants it and is thus very much the same as a martyr. She testifies through her humiliation. Magdalene is Jesus. She begins by testifying against her Savior. The dissociation of the two instances is still far too naive in terms of its affects. It is God to whose eyes suffering is exposed and to whose heart it is offered in terms of political economy. It is the pimp, here flakes Herod or Pilate, who makes more money from the suffering, drawing a profit from it, and thus ignoring it as such.
That was good about Christ prostituting himself. Stuff about the Antichrist was interesting as well.
Later on, he's drawing this metaphor, or even here too, like he's brings it up really briefly. Magdalene is Jesus. Jesus is prostitute, and there being sort of an equivalency there in that relationship between pimp and prostitute, and I guess God the Father and Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He goes really quickly from from the prostitute to the martyr to Jesus, right? It's a pretty seamless step he's taking.
Exchange is big here, but I don't know exactly where that leads us. But I don't know this. I feel like this is one of the passages or one of the areas where he's getting most into this notion of libidinal exchange. And this is under the section "Use Me" as well. I think in particular, I'll read this too. In the dead of the night, in the utter exhaustion of palms and expressions, penis and vulva in rags, the earth indiscriminately scorched, this order may yet issue from the depths of a woman's hoarsened throat. Use me. And this means there is no me. Prostitution is the political aspect of dependency, but it also has a libidinal position besides. This is what Sade overlooked. The question of passivity is not the question of slavery, the question of dependency, not the plea to be dominated. There is no dialectic of the slave, neither Hegel's nor the dialectic of the hysteric, according to Lacan, both presupposing the permutation of roles on the inside of a space of domination. This is all macho bullshit. Use me tends towards the direction of the erect member above the loins, the illusion of power, or the relation of domination.
I don't know if it's in this work or not. I can't remember. But when Lyotard talks about like passivity, that usually gets tied to like some regards into like Stoic philosophy about, you know, kind of like how to survive like these forces of capitalism, which then ties directly into what people usually call like Lyotard's accelerationist undercurrent, which is, you know, you become so capitalist or whatever that I guess like accelerationism in the Bullinger sense, where it's like you become so capitalist that capitalism can't even, like the logic of capitalism doesn't make sense for that. And part of me wonders how much of this in terms of like prostitution is a setup for the notion, at least in like Marxist analysis or critique, which it's like the proletariat is oppressed, you know, but how much of this oppression is
desired,
yes,
consciously, perhaps. I think that's maybe the big distinction too, is like, because that's the famous quote from the book is about the steel workers in England getting jouissance from the destruction of their bodies working in the steel mills. So I think maybe you're right. He's setting up that metaphor for this sort of this libidinal transgression that he's not really making a judge. I don't know. It's not a repressive force. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting how he says in that sentence, like, the passion of passivity is not one single force, but it's force itself. You know, just to go to what you're saying, like pure passivity is just pure, I don't know what, like release to force itself, or what's the better way to put it? Like, not sacrifice, but it is like being a martyr to force itself, to not put up a fight in any regard, to try and dominate the force itself.
Yeah.
To kind of, what is it called? Like allow a flow in a way. Like,
right. Succumb. I'm trying to think of like the perfect word for what I was trying.
He says here, the passion of passivity, which stimulates the offer, is not one single force, a resource of force in battle. It is force, puissance itself, liquidating all stases, which here and there block the passages of intensity, which is exactly, what you were going to, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So would that be like, I guess like coming from 68 would be like not a revolutionary force that's against it, but you know, to use that quote, it's like not to withdraw from the world market, but to accelerate it, or
maybe the flows are not decoded yet, or not. Yeah. What is it? Maybe the flows are not yet deterritorialized
enough. Which is like, exactly. It's like don't create a blockage, instead going through capitalism, not opposing it. But I don't know. I think Kub, you brought it up. I think he is just setting up some crumbs for what's to come later on in the book. But at the same time, I'm like, how much of this you guys think is also just a criticism of theology and their Catholic underbringing for a lot of these philosophers? I don't know. Maybe that's another
small aspect of the evil book, taken more literally, right, of this carrying on. I mean, he mentioned Sade and the, how's it translated? It's like, yet again, Frenchmen, if you want to be Republicans, right? Where he's basically saying we got to get rid of the Catholic Church and all its fucking like fetters on our political, collective society as a whole. We got to root it out and extirpate it, including its whole, not just its rituals, but its it's Judeo-Christian moralism. It's holding us back as being truly, citizens of a free society. And so yeah, I wonder if some of that is, which is why Lyotard, what Coop read, it says like, this is something Sade overlooked. Like he's obviously turning to Klosowski and Sade and even Freud and these other thinkers and trying to articulate a kind of, obviously like a kind of libidinal atheism, if you will, right? This unmooring of the libidinal flows from their source in some sort of transcendent, well, really, it's also what he'll call meta-narratives, right? God is just, or the Catholic Church provides one of those safe and very well spread out through imperialism and these other things historically, but this, mass disseminated sort of ways of fitting in, be it dogma and doctrine, fitting into this collective body that supposedly has not only its autonomy, but its hierarchy, and it has the access point through which we have to go to either commune with God or to gain, through a priest, our salvation through repentance, etc. Right? I mean, the Catholic Church itself has functioned as that exclusionary device too, right? Because the threat of excommunication is supposedly, at least theoretically, dogmatically, the threat of eternal damnation. So it is that choke point of societal, especially, I suppose in the 70s things would have been more quote unquote liberal, but even in the 1770s and 1780s, after the French Revolution, you see that the Catholic Church is not so easy to overthrow, and it's still a standard in traditional French culture. And so, I think you're onto something there and this is interesting that he doesn't really even mention the Catholic Church, but he's going back to one of its founding fathers with Augustine and taking beef with him. So there is this interesting displacement of a more direct attack on the very sub foundations of European Christian theology.
So it's like, just a meme, libidinal theology or crypto-libidinal theology. Like a critique of crypto-libidinal theology already within libidinal economy. In a way, I guess just to kind of salvage something out of that meme, if you take Deleuze and Guattari's work as a critique of, you could say, the state itself, right? Like that, it's a metaphysical project of attacking the state, or the structure of the state in a way of, you could say, the mind that's structuring. Wouldn't libidinal economy be the same thing? But the state isn't just, to be so literal, the actual government or the structuring of a government, but it's also, the God, the state, the church, that whole chain of signification. You can maybe sum it up that way.
I like how you put that, the argument being made, I think you're right, is a metaphysical argument with political implications. It's highly metaphysical in that there's several different applications that exist beyond just the political scene or the economic scene.
With Deleuze and Guattari, it's with the whole notion of virtuality, it's if the idea is just as real as the actual material constitution of that object, or whatever you want to call it, the idea itself. Is Lyotard not doing the same thing, but with libidinal intensities? Then if the state itself, objects of oppression are created through libidinal intensities, things that we desire, it's those systems or those structures, they are created precisely because, it's okay, well, what do people desire? It's they want to go to that, the whole quote about the pubs, the mill workers, they want to go, they don't care about destroying their bodies because they desire an identity. They desire an identity outside of their peasantry class, and so in a lot of ways, it's we make these metaphysical structures real. We actually impose them in the real world, not because the structures precede the actual material objects, but because the material objects themselves, or these material systems, in a way that they're working at the same time, right? The ultimate metaphysical object is the state itself, and vice versa. The state itself is that oppressive structure in our mind, that indispensable node that we can't get rid of.
Kill the fascist in your head.
Exactly.
Like that.
Exactly.
What about this paragraph? I think this goes to a little bit more of like the literal sort of exchange, but in the context, I think, of this relationship between, I guess, pimp and prostitute. It must be related to the peculiar status, rather, of the criminal. He's at the same time both pimp and client, or rather, neither one nor the other. The pimp brings the partial pulsion of the client back into the bosom of the ghost body of society under the form of the monetary equivalent. The client, in consuming his pulsional energy in the production of his phantasms with the help of the prostitute, produces a libidinal equivalent of currency. But it is essential that the criminal leave the system of equivalence between the pulsion and the money. If money remains present in its libidinal countency, it is no longer as the substitute or the simulacrum. It comes under the headings of a region of the body, which can no longer be then the alleged social body, but necessarily the great libidinal skin, which, like any other, can and must be grasped by the libido and be submitted to its consummatory irradiation. Currency, language itself, become the object of the libertine's maneuvers in the same way as is the body. Like, I think this is interesting in this sort of dyadic or dyad-like nature of the criminal. He's bringing the partial pulsion of the client back into the bosom of the ghost body of society under the form of monetary equivalent, and the client, in consuming their pulsional energy in the production of his phantasms with the help of the prostitute, produces a libidinal equivalent of currency.
Now, it's interesting. It's interesting where it goes from talking about the pimp, right, institutes the exchange of money, and then the client is the exchange of the drive energy or the pulsion energy,
right?
But then it's unclear: is the criminal the pimp? Is it the prostitute? Is it neither? Is it the client? Right? Would all three be on the outside of or out of the transgressing legal parameters? I mean, obviously, like in some societies today, like in Canada, you have a legit way of doing it, even if you might have illegal forms of prostitution as well. But I'm wondering the slipperiness of that term of who's the criminal. Are all three criminal?
Right.
So the criminal leaves the system of equivalence between the pimp. It's made up by the pimp, prostitute, client triangle. So the criminal seems to be a fourth class, a totally more generic class.
Homo criminalis.
Right, there you go. So the criminal leaves the sense. Now, again, it's a little strange here. So he's both pimp and client, or rather neither one nor the other, right? It's this. I think there's a lot of that to Lyotard, this both at the same time, but also both not at the same time.
Maybe I should read this as well I think this is going on along the same lines. It is precisely when the pimp establishes a relationship between perversion and the social body, between the tensor sign and the intelligent sign, and when he thus proves to be the only really institutive connection of the negotiating body itself, that the criminal is used as disconnection. The withdrawal of his fortune and its squandering to the ends of the untransmittable pleasure are provocations destined to give rise to the alternative before the dissimulation or duplicity of signs necessarily invests a politics of the libido. Either recognize that the repudiation of complete monstrosity by institutions is reversed into de facto prostitution, material and moral, admitting therefore that the generalized system of commodities is the system of prostitution under the cover of the trade of objects and services, and nothing else besides, or affirm that there is only one authentically universal communication, the exchange of bodies by the secret language of bodily signs, of which Sade's Woman Criminal provides the principle and illustrates one effect, the effect of insurrection or perpetual shaking of the circle of exchanges by the passions, to speak in the manner of Blanchot.
He brings that prostitution metaphor into the whole general exchange of commodities.
He goes on, though, I think this might help perhaps clear this up too, it is from posing the libidinal political problem under this alternative, either the communication of beings through the exchange of their bodies, called perversion, or prostitution under the sign of dead currency, which is capital. In any case, mercantilism, that Klosowski forges his impossible fiction of a living currency.
So either perversion or prostitution, and I suppose he would want to be like, it's both at the same time, but neither. I mean, in that sense, Lyotard is already playing with these different theories of signs and doing this kind of Aufhebung sublation behind your back type thing.
It's like in that middle part, admitting therefore that the generalized systems of commodities is a system of prostitution under the cover of trades of objects and services, and nothing else besides, or affirm that there is only one authentically universal communication, the exchange of bodies by the secret language bodily signs, of which Sade's woman's criminal provides the principle and illustrates one effect, the effect of insurrection or perpetual shaking. It's just, as to summarize, I think you've already mentioned this, Taylor. I think it's like it ties back to what we'll see in like chapter 3, which is like that whole notion of exchange of, or like one desires something, and that exchange itself is or could be diagrammed as prostitution, and it's like if that's not what like a market is, then it's like what do you defer it to? What exactly is it then?
Right.
You're sort of. I'm just thinking very, I guess, vulgar Marxian terms. It's like to sell your labor, it's selling your body.
Yeah.
So in that sense, this prostitution metaphor is quite spot on. But he's being, obviously, I think it's a lot sexier, right? To bring up a prostitute and a pimp, to drive home this ultimate truth about libidinal economy as expressed through capitalism, or the reverse of that, whatever.
Which
Capitalism
seems like a very
expressed as libidinal economy.
Which seems to me kind of like a very strong point almost to like want to bring up, because like at least in like contemporary like the United States like Protestant work ethic, this whole notion of like prostitution, of like distinct criminal acts, and how in a way like it's not even like the act itself that is seen as morally reprehensible or whatever. It's simply reprehensible. It's just kind of like the whole notion of like, well, it's just perverse, so therefore it's bad. It's like this, like just the mere connection that it has with like just sexuality in general, like this piety in Protestant Christianity, that if you brought this up to someone, they'd be like, well, that's not at all what we mean.
It's interesting. There's almost like, I think we sense this in like a mythological way when people always say that prostitution is the oldest occupation. I mean, if you really think about what that means, it's literally like what Lyotard is saying.
That's so good. Yeah. Very nice.
Exchange itself begins at prostitution.
Exactly. At libidinal. Yeah. That's the libidinal economy.
Yeah.
That's really good. Yeah. Because I was going to say this paragraph, this might be like maybe the highlight of the chapter, or like really what draws out everything that he's trying to get at.
All economies are libidinal.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
The exchange of bodies by the secret language of bodily signs.
How much of this directly impacts Baudrillard, like commodity fetishism in a way? Like, how, I guess like it's...
I think in Seduction, that might be the book to read to tie this into Baudrillard.
Seduction's good. Also, a critique of the political economy of the sign.
And I think that, speaking of logic of sense again, one of the essays there is called in the section Phantasm of Modern Literature, he has an essay on Klosowski. It's called Klosowski's or Body's Language, which I thought was interesting. So it would be interesting here to compare that essay with this last part of the chapter that really focuses on Klosowski, and it might help to bring to light some of the arguments Lyotard's making. It looks like I don't remember this essay. I remember reading it, but I don't remember it because it's kind of hard. It's kind of like second degree indirect learning when we haven't read Klosowski's novels.
Yeah. But I think even like this whole notion of exchange between pimp and prostitute and John or whatever, like this is a very good crystallization, I think, of this whole way to negotiate this relationship, this social relation in the context of libido and libidinal economy, and how that applies to capitalism and exchange and value and also pleasure, right? Because he's saying here the criminal is used as a disconnection, the withdrawal of his fortune and squandering to the ends of untransmittable pleasure, provocation designed to give rise to the alternative, before which dissimulation or duplicity of signs necessarily invests a politics of the libido. Either recognize that the repudiation of complete monstrosity by institutions is reversed into de facto prostitution, material and moral, admitting therefore that the generalized system of commodities is the system of prostitution under the cover of the trade of objects and services and nothing else besides, or affirm there's only one authentically universal communication, the exchange of bodies by the secret language of bodily signs. I mean, that's libidinal. That lays out libidinal economics right there, I think. I don't know how to necessarily chop that down into something a little bit more digestible, but that, to me, I think does a great job of sort of summing up one of the major arguments.
Libido is material, and exchange, when we're talking about exchange is always a material exchange.
Exactly. The exchange of bodies, because we're all producing whatever commodity is being produced by the body somehow, right? At some level, even if it's information work, right? Mm-hmm. That is coming from a mind or a brain or like communication, etc. So yeah, this prostitution metaphor is like very provocative, but it's right. It's kind of stripping away all the bullshit about capitalism and like putting it out on Front Street that, oh, this is not about, it's all sort of this mystification of social relations, of exchange between bodies that is ultimately in the capitalist context always going to be about, that. Yeah. And then sort of taking that.
It takes Marx to its logical conclusion when Marx says that, political economy mystifies things, and the way we figure out a science of the economy is, as he says, to enter into the hidden abode of production. But Lyotard makes this great connection that the hidden abode of production is desire itself.
Yeah, exactly.
It's getting to that materiality, that the production of desire, in the same way that Marx kind of stopped at the production of value through labor. It's taking it further and further into the actual science of economy, which is also the science of libido.
I like this too. There's like this little italicized portion about monstrosity by institutions is reversed into de facto prostitution, material and moral, admitting therefore that the generalized system of commodities in the system of prostitution under the cover of the trade of objects and services and nothing else besides. You're right. This is extremely like this materialist critique of economics in a way that is provocative and really drives home, I think, you're right, this notion of libidinal economy very distinctly.
Coop, if you want to go up just real quick to the page before this one. There is none of this in Society of the Friends of Crime, however, a society cut from the social body, neither catching a perverse passions nor concentrating them in it. Compared to the pimp and the cop, the criminal is a very rich man, 25,000 annual income, 10,000 francs in expenses per victim for furthering jouissance. And his function is not at all the concentration of the partial pulsions. These expended in profusion of the bodies of subjects will never be inscribed on the social body as money, thanks to the criminal's intervention. If Marx calls all profit stealing, in a way, like almost like everyone that participates in capitalism through like this labor exchange of like, wage labor is like a criminal. Like they're all making money. They're all, in a way, it's like, if you want to make a moral distinction here, they're all criminals. But I don't want to like moralize or be over reductive here, because at the same time, as we clearly see, it's for a moment of jouissance. Like, is the person who's seeking out these things a criminal? Is the person that's actually engaging in the act itself a criminal? Even like in things like when even capitalists moralize something like the black market, right? It's still participating in these monetary exchange systems, but it's deemed quote unquote undesirable or morally reprehensible because of the things that are being exchanged. But what's the difference between a legitimized system,
right?
Like the merchant system, like the current exchanges of commodities that we participate in, and then those of like the criminal underworld. And it's
every capitalist is a pimp, every worker is a prostitute, every consumer is a John.
Mm-hmm.
Do you guys remember the band album cover for that one album of the Dead Kennedys? Right, it's
the
famous I forget the photographer who did it, but it's just all you see are dicks and asses, right? It's this montage of a kind of repeating image of dicks and asses, fucking asses, right? So we're all capitalists, so we fuck others, and we all get fucked by others. And I see Lyotard putting this out a little bit more theoretically, in a more theoretically interesting way, using Klosowski's work here.
We do have this cultural moment, though, where people are starting to kind of have sympathy or literally decriminalize prostitution from the perspective of the prostitute,
Sex work is definitely something that's becoming it's becoming sort of normalized, right?
Right.
To a degree heretofore unseen because of the procession of, or like capital's inability to reproduce its own success or like abundance to fulfill its own promise. I don't know if we want to wrap up there, but I felt like, I don't know, that's a good quote to end up on. And
I agree.
Again, this too goes to that, I think, larger point that Lyotard is making is there's no real positive expression for desire. Like desire is desire. It's not, you know what I mean? No matter what, it's predicated on exchange between bodies, let's say. And then I think as we move through the book, we'll probably uncover what that means or the other implications, or he'll probably put forth a more rigorous argumentation about what that looks like. But I think this is a good window into the rest of the book. I'm really excited to dig into chapter 3 in particular, which is where we'll be looking at Marx quite a bit more directly.
And I think as we read, I think we'll end up coming back to this chapter a lot, because I think it's hard to just talk about this chapter without the context of the book. Right. Exactly. And I think the complexity of this chapter gets a little bit unfolded with 3 and 4 especially. And we can sort of plug these into each other as we go. Yeah,
for sure. I think he's going to build on this chapter quite a bit. Certainly in the next one. Any final thoughts before we wrap up for the day? Final thoughts, plugs, whatever you want to do.
Use me as a great subheader. That's all.
No, we're good. I mean, Coop, I'll be back in all kinds of various forms. If you guys want to hear more of me, check out Chaos v Street. I think I plugged that last time. Yeah. But hoping to get another episode of that out soon and just become a better sound editor, because that's the only thing that's delayed by my episode. So yeah, gotta learn on the fly.
Cute. Do you have any pieces coming out in the future?
I'm working on something. So I do a newsletter, which you should sign up for. If you want to know the location of it, I have it linked in my link tree, which is on my Twitter at CN Noumena, or is it C Noumena?
C Noumena.
Mm-hmm.
And in there I go through my whole thing with my newsletter, and then I update what I'm working on and what I'm doing. And I am currently working on a piece. It's a bit of a longer one than I usually try to keep them 2 to 3 minutes long, but this one is a bit longer, and so that's why I didn't release one on Friday, which I usually release them every Friday, but this one, I think people will like this one.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that. And looking forward to new Chaosophy Street too. It's fun to do this. It's nice to talk to you guys.
Oh yeah, I love it. It was great.
It's very helpful too.
You got another monster episode to edit, so hopefully all our audio came in pretty smooth, so it's not too much of a chore for you.
Should be pretty well.
Nice.
But Young, you didn't really give us your @ handle or anything.
Yeah, just follow me on Twitter, Young Agamben.
Why Agamben?
That is Why Agamben, yeah. And definitely look at everybody's media that's in this podcast. Hopefully I'll do some writing soon and just post it on my Twitter, but I don't have anything directly in the works, but that's sort of like a medium term thing going on. But follow me on Twitter.
I'll have everyone's links up in the show notes, but this will be the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry signing off for the week.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people as in Clockwork Orange.